The morning sun was just starting to peek over the hills when Maggie Thompson pulled her old Honda into the parking lot of Pine Ridge Shooting Range. At 72, she moved a bit slower than she used to, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She'd been looking forward to this Tuesday morning visit for weeks. Maggie grabbed her worn leather gun case from the back seat. The case had seen better days. The brown leather was faded and cracked in places, held together with a few pieces of electrical tape. It wasn't much to look at, but it had been with her for over 30 years. The shooting range was quiet this early in the morning. Just a few cars in the parking lot, which was exactly how Maggie liked it. She preferred the peaceful atmosphere over the crowded weekends when everyone seemed to be in a hurry. As she walked toward the entrance, she noticed 3 young men unloading expensive-looking equipment from a shiny black pickup truck. They had on matching tactical vests, fancy shooting glasses, and boots that probably cost more than her monthly grocery bill. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered with perfectly styled hair, the kind of guy who probably spent more time at the gym than most people spent at work. Another was shorter but stocky, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. The third was lean and wiry, constantly checking his phone between hauling gear. Maggie paid them little attention as she made her way to the range office. The young man behind the counter looked up from his coffee and smiled politely, though she could see the assumption forming in his eyes. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, speaking a bit louder than necessary. "First time at our range?" "No, dear," Maggie replied softly. "I've been coming here off and on for about 5 years now." The clerk looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, I'm sorry. I don't think I recognize you." "I'm Danny, the new range officer. Started here last month." "That explains it," Maggie nodded. "I'm Maggie. I usually come in on weekday mornings when it's quiet." Danny seemed relieved to have an explanation, but still looked uncertain. "Well, let me just go over our safety rules real quick, just to make sure everyone's on the same page." What followed was a 10-minute explanation of basic gun safety that Maggie could have recited in her sleep. Danny spoke slowly and clearly, as if he was talking to someone who might not understand. Maggie listened politely, nodding at appropriate moments, even though she probably knew more about firearm safety than Danny would learn in years. "Now, we have different distance options," Danny continued, pulling out a laminated chart. "For beginners, I usually recommend starting at the 25-yard line. We have some really nice large targets that are perfect for getting comfortable with shooting." "The 100-yard range will be fine," Maggie said quietly. Danny's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, well, that's pretty advanced. Are you sure? I mean, no judgment, but most people work their way up to that distance." "I'm sure, thank you." After paying her range fee, Maggie made her way down to lane 15, the furthest one from the entrance. She preferred the end lanes, less foot traffic, more peaceful. She set her old gun case down on the bench and began her routine. The 3 men from the parking lot had claimed lanes 7, 8, and 9, right in the middle of the range. They were busy setting up what looked like enough equipment for a small army unit. Multiple rifle cases, boxes of ammunition, shooting rests, spotting scopes, and various gadgets that Maggie couldn't identify. As she quietly arranged her much simpler setup, she couldn't help but overhear their conversation. "Did you see that old lady at the counter?" the tall one was saying to his friends. His voice carried easily across the indoor range. Danny was giving her the full beginner's speech. The stocky one in the baseball cap snorted. Probably her first time touching a gun. "I bet she saw it in a movie and thought it looked fun." $20 says she can't even hold it steady," added the lean one, not bothering to lower his voice. "Look at her shaking over there." Maggie wasn't shaking, she was simply going through her methodical preparation routine, but she chose not to correct them. She learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. She opened her gun case, revealing a Remington 700 that gleamed despite its obvious age. The rifle was pristine, every surface carefully maintained and polished. To most people, it looked like just an old hunting rifle. They wouldn't notice the subtle modifications, the precision scope, or the way every component had been carefully calibrated. "Oh man, look at Grandma's antique," the tall one said, louder now. "That thing probably hasn't been fired since World War II. His friends laughed, and a few other shooters glanced over with uncomfortable expressions. Most people on the range minded their own business, but the 3 were making it hard to ignore them. Maggie continued her setup, checking her scope settings and laying out her ammunition with practiced precision. Each movement was economical and purposeful, but the young men were too busy showing off their own expensive gear to notice. "Hey, ma'am," the stocky one called out, walking over toward her lane. "You know, if you need any help over there, we'd be happy to give you some pointers. We come here pretty regularly." "That's very kind," Maggie replied politely. "But I think I'll manage." "I mean, no offense, but that rifle's got to be heavy for someone your size," he continued. "And the 100-yard targets can be pretty tricky, even for experienced shooters." "I appreciate your concern," Maggie said, her voice still gentle but with just a hint of firmness. The lean one had joined his friend and was looking at her setup with obvious amusement. "Is that your grandson's rifle or something? Looks like it belongs in a museum." "It's mine," Maggie said simply. The tall one was now standing behind them, grinning widely. "Well, hey, we've got some extra targets if you need them. Got some really nice big ones that might work better for you. And if you want, we could set you up at the 25-yard line. Might be more appropriate." Other shooters were starting to pay attention now. An older man with a gray beard was frowning in their direction. A middle-aged woman shook her head disapprovingly, but nobody said anything. Maggie finished her setup and looked at the three young men with a patient smile. "Thank you for the offer, but I think I'll stick with my plan." "Suit yourself," the tall one shrugged, walking back to his lane. "Don't say we didn't try to help." As they returned to their own equipment, their voices carried clearly across the range. "Some people just have to learn the hard way," one said. "At least when she embarrasses herself, she'll be far enough away that we won't get blamed," another added. "Hope she doesn't hurt herself with that cannon," the third chimed in. Maggie took a deep breath and settled into her shooting position. She'd heard worse in her time, and she'd learned that actions spoke louder than words. But as she looked down range at her target, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. These young men had no idea what they were about to witness. The range went quiet for a moment as everyone prepared for the first round of shooting. Maggie had just finished adjusting her scope when she realized she'd forgotten to grab extra targets from the front desk. She'd been so focused on her setup that it had slipped her mind. She walked over to where the three men were still organizing their equipment. They had enough targets stacked up to last them the entire morning. "Excuse me," Maggie said politely, approaching the tall one who seemed to be the leader of the group. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I forgot to pick up extra targets at the front desk. Would you happen to have a couple I could borrow?" The three men exchanged glances, and she could see them trying not to smirk. The tall one scratched his chin thoughtfully as if her simple request required serious consideration. "Well, I don't know," he said slowly, drawing out his words. "These are pretty advanced targets. They're designed for serious shooters who can actually hit them." His friends chuckled, appreciatively at what they thought was clever humor. "I have some beginner targets in my truck," the stocky one offered with fake helpfulness. "They're the really big ones, you know? Like twice the size of regular targets. Perfect for someone just starting out. Or maybe," the lean one added, "you'd be better off with one of those huge cardboard boxes from the trash. Can't miss something that big, right?" The older man with the gray beard who'd been watching earlier was now openly staring at them with disapproval. A few other shooters had stopped what they were doing to listen. The uncomfortable tension in the air was getting thicker by the minute. "Any target would be fine," Maggie said calmly, ignoring their tone. "I just need something to aim at." "Tell you what," the tall one said, reaching into his box and pulling out a standard target. "I'll give you this one, but maybe you should think about moving up to the 25-yard line instead of way back there at 100 yards. I mean, be realistic about your skill level, you know?" "The distance I chose will be fine," Maggie replied, accepting the target with a gracious nod. "Thank you for this." As she walked back to her lane, she could hear them talking behind her, not even trying to keep their voices down anymore. "She's going to embarrass herself so bad," the stocky one was saying. "I almost feel sorry for her." "Almost" being the key word, the lean one replied. "Some people need to learn their limits the hard way." "I give her 3 shots before she gives up and goes home," the tall one declared. "That rifle's probably got more kick than she's expecting." A middle-aged woman at lane 3 looked up from her own setup and shot them a dirty look. "Some people have no manners," she muttered, just loud enough for them to hear. The 3 men either didn't hear her or chose to ignore the comment. They were too busy setting up their expensive equipment and continuing their running commentary about Maggie. "Look at how she's walking," the lean one observed as Maggie made her way back down the range. She's probably already nervous about the noise. Bet she forgot to bring ear protection that actually works. Oh man, when that thing goes off, she's gonna jump 3 feet in the air, the stocky one added. Might even drop the rifle. Danny, the young range officer, was making his rounds checking on everyone's setup. When he got to the 3 men's lanes, they straightened up and acted more professional. How's everything going over here, guys? Danny asked. Great, the tall one replied. Just getting ready for some serious shooting. We're working on our long-range precision today. Awesome, Danny nodded approvingly. You guys always bring the best equipment. Really impressive stuff. The 3 men beamed at the compliment, their chests puffing out with pride. Hey, Danny, the lean one said casually. You might want to keep an eye on the old lady down at lane 15. She seems a little, I don't know, maybe overwhelmed by everything. Danny glanced down toward Maggie's lane. She seemed fine when I talked to her earlier. I'm just saying, the stocky one chimed in. She's got this old rifle that looks like it weighs more than she does. And she's insisting on shooting at 100 yards on her first day. Might be setting herself up for disappointment. Or injury, the tall one added with mock concern. Those old rifles can have a serious kick. Someone her age might not be ready for it. Danny looked uncertain. Well, she seemed to know what she was doing when she signed the waiver. Just keep an eye on her, that's all we're saying, the lean one said. We'd hate to see someone get hurt because they bit off more than they could chew. After Danny moved on, the 3 men went back to their commentary, but now they were even more confident in their opinions. They'd managed to plant seeds of doubt in the range officer's mind, which only fed their sense of superiority. See how she's holding that rifle? The tall one pointed out to his friends. Way too tense. She's going to be sore tomorrow. If she makes it through more than a few shots, the stocky one replied. I'm telling you, one good recoil and she'll be done. Maybe we should record this, the lean one suggested, pulling out his phone. Could be pretty funny to watch later. The older man with the gray beard had heard enough. He walked over from his lane and stood behind them with his arms crossed. You boys might want to focus on your own shooting instead of worrying about everyone else, he said firmly. The 3 men turned around, slightly startled by his presence. Just making conversation, the tall one said defensively. No harm in that. There's a difference between conversation and being disrespectful, the older man replied. That lady's not bothering anyone. Maybe show her the same courtesy. Hey, we offered to help her, the stocky one protested. We even gave her a target. We're being nice. The older man studied them for a moment, then shook his head and walked back to his lane without another word. But his message was clear. He didn't approve of their behavior. This only seemed to make the 3 men more defensive and, unfortunately, more vocal about their opinions. Some people are so sensitive, the lean one said, loud enough for the older man to hear. We're just being realistic about skill levels. Exactly, the tall one agreed. There's nothing wrong with suggesting someone start at an appropriate level for their experience. Down at lane 15, Maggie was going through her final preparations. She'd clipped her target to the carrier and sent it out to the 100-yard mark. The target looked impossibly small from that distance, especially to anyone watching who wasn't experienced with long-range shooting. She returned to her shooting position and began loading her rifle. Each movement was precise and practiced, but to the casual observer, she might have looked like someone going through the motions without really knowing what she was doing. Here we go, the stocky one announced to his friends. Showtime. This is going to be painful to watch, the lean one added. But entertaining, the tall one concluded with a grin. They had no idea how right they were about the entertaining part. The range officer called for the line to go hot, and shooters began settling into their positions. Maggie took her place behind her rifle with a calmness that seemed almost unusual, while other shooters were making last-minute adjustments to their equipment or checking their targets one more time. She simply closed her eyes for a moment and took 3 slow, deep breaths. When she opened her eyes, something had changed. The nervous grandmother that everyone assumed they were watching had disappeared. In her place was someone completely different, focused, controlled, and absolutely still. She brought the rifle to her shoulder with a fluid motion that looked almost effortless. Her left hand found its position on the stock naturally, as if the gun was part of her body. Her right eye aligned with the scope while her left eye remained open. A technique that most casual shooters never learned. The 3 men at lane 7, 8, and 9 were busy with their own preparations, but they kept glancing over at Maggie. Waiting for what they expected would be an embarrassing display. The tall one was having trouble with his expensive rifle rest, trying to get it adjusted just right. The stocky one was fiddling with his scope settings, turning knobs and muttering under his breath. The lean one was checking his phone between looking through his spotting scope. When Maggie's first shot rang out, the sound was crisp and clean. There was no hesitation, no extended aiming period, just a smooth trigger pull that sent the bullet downrange with precision. At first, nobody paid much attention. One shot didn't mean anything. But when she fired her second shot just 15 seconds later, with the same controlled rhythm, a few people started to take notice. The older man with the gray beard, who had confronted the three troublemakers earlier, was at lane 2 working with his own rifle. His name was Walter, and he'd been shooting competitively for over 20 years. He knew good form when he saw it, and something about Maggie's technique was catching his attention. Her breathing pattern was perfect. She fired at the natural pause between breaths, when her body was most stable. Her trigger finger moved straight back with no sideways pressure that could throw off the shot. Most importantly, she had that rare quality that separated good shooters from great ones. She was completely relaxed while maintaining perfect control. Walter lowered his rifle and watched more carefully. In his years of competitive shooting, he'd seen thousands of people at the range. Most of them, even the good ones, had little habits or quirks that showed their training background. Hunting guides held their rifles differently than competitive shooters. Police officers had a distinct stance from their training. Military personnel often showed specific techniques from their service. What Walter was seeing looked very much like military precision shooting, but refined by years of practice. "Frank," Walter called out to his shooting partner at the next lane. "Take a look at lane 15. Frank was a Vietnam veteran who spent most of his retirement at the shooting range. He'd seen enough military shooters to recognize the signs. When he focused on Maggie's position and technique, his eyebrows raised significantly. "Well, I'll be," Frank said quietly. "Look at that breathing discipline." Maggie fired her third shot, and again the timing was perfect. No wasted motion, no unnecessary adjustments. Just smooth professional shooting that was beginning to create a distinct pattern on her target. Meanwhile, the three men who had been so eager to watch her fail were struggling with their own shooting. The tall one's expensive rifle rest wasn't helping him as much as he'd expected. His shots were scattered around the target with no real pattern. "This thing must need adjustment," he said loudly, as if the equipment was to blame for his poor shooting. The stocky one was having his own problems. Despite all his expensive gear, his shots were hitting low and to the left consistently. "Wind must be stronger than I thought," he announced, though there was barely any wind that day. The lean one wasn't doing much better. His shots were all over the place, and he was getting frustrated with each pull of the trigger. "These targets are harder to see than usual," he complained. While they struggled and made excuses, Maggie continued her steady rhythm, shot after shot with mechanical precision that was starting to draw attention from other lanes. Walter couldn't help himself. During a ceasefire period when everyone was checking targets, he walked down toward Maggie's lane. He wanted a closer look at both her equipment and her target. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said politely as he approached. "I couldn't help but notice your shooting. Really nice technique." "Thank you," Maggie replied with a modest smile. "Just trying to stay in practice." Walter's eyes moved to her rifle case, which was open beside her. That's when he noticed details that made his pulse quicken. The case had faded military markings that were barely visible unless you knew what to look for. There was also a small weathered patch attached to the inside lid, the kind that military units gave to their members. "Mind if I ask where you learned to shoot like that?" Walter inquired carefully. "Here and there," Maggie said, which wasn't really an answer but wasn't exactly evasive either. Frank had joined Walter, drawn by curiosity about what had caught his friend's attention. When Frank saw Maggie's target through the spotting scope, his jaw dropped. "Ma'am," Frank said, his voice filled with respect, "that's some seriously impressive shooting. Those shots are grouped tighter than most people could manage at 50 yards, let alone 100. The three men at the middle lanes were close enough to overhear this conversation, and their own frustrations were making them even more bitter. "Oh, come on," the tall one said loudly. "How good could it really be? She's probably just getting lucky." Frank turned toward them with an expression that could have frozen water. As a veteran, he had very little patience for people who dismissed others without cause. "Son," Frank said firmly, I've been shooting for 50 years, including 2 tours in Vietnam. I know good shooting when I see it, and what I'm seeing over there is better than good." The lean one laughed dismissively. "No offense, old-timer, but you're probably just being nice. We've been watching her, and she doesn't look like she knows what she's doing." This was exactly the wrong thing to say to Frank. His face darkened, and Walter put a warning hand on his friend's arm. "Easy, Frank," Walter said quietly. But Frank was studying Maggie more carefully now, and something was clicking in his memory. The patch in her rifle case, her shooting technique, the way she carried herself. It was all adding up to something that seemed impossible but was making more and more sense. "Ma'am," Frank said, walking closer to Maggie's lane, "I don't mean to pry, but is your name Thompson by any chance?" Maggie looked up from loading her rifle, and for just a moment her careful composure slipped. "Yes, it is." Frank's eyes widened. "Monsieur Thompson?" "Margaret Thompson," she confirmed, though she seemed reluctant to elaborate. Frank stood there for a moment processing this information. Then very quietly he asked, "Army?" Maggie nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that confirmed what Frank was beginning to suspect. The 3 troublemakers were still within earshot, but they were too busy complaining about their own poor shooting to pay attention to this conversation. They had no idea that they were about to learn something that would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet grandmother at Lane 15. Frank looked like he wanted to say more, but he respected Maggie's obvious desire for privacy. Instead, he just nodded respectfully and said, "Thank you for your service, ma'am." But Walter caught the look in Frank's eyes, and he knew his friend had recognized something significant. The question was what? Frank stepped closer to Maggie, lowering his voice so only she and Walter could hear. His hands were actually trembling slightly as he spoke. "Ma'am, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I have to ask. Are you the same M. Thompson who served in Afghanistan? The one they called?" He paused, seeming almost afraid to say the name. "Deadshot Thompson?" Maggie's rifle paused halfway to her shoulder. For a moment, she looked like she was deciding whether to answer. Finally, she gave a small nod. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. Walter's eyes went wide. He'd heard the stories, the kind of legendary tales that got passed around veteran circles but seemed too incredible to be true. Stories about impossible shots made in impossible conditions, about a female sniper who could hit targets that other trained marksmen couldn't even see clearly. "Holy," Walter started, then caught himself. "Ma'am, I've heard stories about you for years. I mean the longest confirmed kill in Army history. That shot in Kandahar province that saved an entire patrol." Frank was nodding enthusiastically. "The one at over 1.5 miles in wind that would challenge most people to hit a barn door." Maggie looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Like I said, that was a long time ago. I'm just here to do some quiet shooting." But their conversation, despite being whispered, had drawn the attention of the 3 men who had been mocking her all morning. The tall one had finished his latest string of poor shots and was walking over with his friends, irritation clear on his face. "What's all the whispering about over here?" he demanded. "Some kind of secret shooting club." Frank turned toward them, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. "You boys have been running your mouths all morning about someone you know nothing about." "We know enough," the stocky one replied arrogantly. "We can see she's way out of her league here." "Yeah," the lean one added, "and now you're filling her head with stories to make her feel better about her shooting. That's nice of you, but it's not helping anyone." Walter shook his head in amazement. "You 3 have no idea who you're talking about." "Some old lady who probably shot her husband's hunting rifle a few times," the tall one said dismissively. "Look, we get it. You're trying to be supportive, but let's be realistic here." That was the final straw for Frank. "Realistic? You want realistic? This woman has more confirmed kills than you 3 have successful shots this morning." The 3 men burst into laughter, the kind of loud, obnoxious laughter that made other shooters at the range turn and stare. "Oh, come on," the stocky one said between laughs. "What is she, some kind of secret agent? A ninja grandma? The deadliest knitter in America?" The lean one added, causing his friends to laugh even harder. The tall one wiped tears from his eyes. "You old guys really stick together, don't you? Making up war stories to make her feel special." Maggie had been listening to this exchange with growing irritation, but it was when they started laughing at Frank and Walter that something changed in her expression. These 2 veterans had shown her respect and kindness. and watching them be ridiculed for telling the truth was more than she could quietly endure. "Gentlemen," Maggie said, her voice still soft but with an edge that hadn't been there before, "you seem very confident in your shooting abilities." "More confident than we are in yours," the tall one replied with a smirk. "Would you be interested in a friendly wager then?" Maggie asked. The three men exchanged glances, sensing an opportunity to prove their point once and for all. "What kind of wager?" the stocky one asked. "Something simple," Maggie said, walking over to her rifle case. She pulled out a small notebook and tore out a page. "I'll shoot at whatever distances you choose. If I can't hit what you consider reasonable targets, I'll apologize for wasting everyone's time and leave quietly." "And if you can hit them?" the lean one asked, though his tone suggested he thought this was impossible. "Then you three apologize to these gentlemen for calling them liars," Maggie said, gesturing toward Frank and Walter. "And you show proper respect to every person on this range, regardless of their age or appearance." The tall one was practically rubbing his hands together with glee. "Deal. But we get to pick the distances and targets." "Fair enough," Maggie agreed. Frank tried to intervene. "Ma'am, you don't need to prove anything to these." "It's all right, Frank," Maggie said with a small smile. "I think it's time for a little demonstration." The word had spread quickly through the range, and other shooters had gathered around to watch. Even Danny, the young range officer, had come over to see what was happening. "Okay," the tall one announced loudly, enjoying being the center of attention. "First shot, 200 yards. Standard bullseye target." Maggie nodded and sent a fresh target out to the 200-yard mark. At that distance, the target looked like a small dot, but she settled into her shooting position with the same calm precision she'd shown all morning. The shot rang out, and everyone waited for the target to come back. When it did, there was a perfect hole dead center in the bullseye. A few people murmured appreciatively, but the three men weren't impressed yet. "Lucky shot," the stocky one declared. "Let's see 300 yards." Another target went out, this time so far that most people needed binoculars to see it clearly. Maggie took a moment longer this time, checking wind conditions that no one else had even noticed. When she fired, the bullet found its mark again, dead center. The murmuring from the crowd was louder now, and the three men were starting to look less confident. 500 yards, the lean one said, his voice a bit strained, "and make it 3 shots in a row." 500 yards was serious long-distance shooting. At that range, factors like wind, humidity, and even the rotation of the earth started to matter. Most recreational shooters never attempted shots at that distance. Maggie sent 3 targets out to the 500-yard line. From where they stood, the targets were barely visible to the naked eye. She made some slight adjustments to her scope, checking her notebook for what looked like wind calculations. Then she fired 3 shots in steady succession, each one spaced about 20 seconds apart. The rhythm was hypnotic, mechanical in its precision. When the targets came back, the crowd fell completely silent. All 3 shots had hit the center ring, grouped so tightly that they could have been covered by a quarter. "That's impossible," the tall one whispered. "No," Frank said proudly. "That's just Margaret Thompson doing what she's always done." The 3 men who had been so confident and mocking all morning now stood in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. The shooting range had never been so quiet during active hours. 23 people stood in complete silence, staring at the 3 targets that had just been brought back from the 500-yard line. The grouping of shots was so tight and so perfectly centered that it looked like something from a shooting manual. The tall one who had been leading the mockery all morning was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. How is that even possible?" Frank stepped forward, his chest swelling with pride as he looked at the stunned faces around him. "Let me tell you exactly who you've been insulting for the past 2 hours." He turned to address not just the 3 men, but everyone who had gathered to watch. "This is Staff Sergeant Margaret Thompson, United States Army, 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, holder of the longest confirmed sniper kill in Army history, 2,715 meters. That's over 1.5 miles for those keeping track." The crowd murmured in amazement, but Frank wasn't finished. "She saved the lives of an entire patrol that was pinned down by enemy fire in a valley where no one else could get a clear shot. Made that kill in 40-mile-per-hour crosswinds, at an elevation that would make most people dizzy just from standing there." Walter nodded enthusiastically. "She's got 3 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star for her service. The Army tried to get her to stay and train other snipers, but she wanted to come home to her family. The stocky one was shaking his head in disbelief. But she's just what? Frank interrupted sharply. Just a woman? Just older than you expected? Just not wearing a uniform that makes her service obvious to ignorant people? Maggie held up her hand gently. Frank, it's okay. No, ma'am, it's not okay, Frank replied firmly. These boys spent all morning disrespecting a genuine American hero, and everyone here needs to understand exactly what that means, Danny. The young range officer looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Ma'am, I am so sorry. If I had known. You couldn't have known, Maggie said kindly, and you were perfectly polite. You were just doing your job. The tall one was staring at his feet, his face red with embarrassment. I don't know what to say. An apology would be a good start, Walter suggested firmly. The three men looked at each other, then back at Maggie. The arrogance and smugness that had defined their behavior all morning had completely evaporated. Ma'am, the tall one began, his voice shaking slightly. I am deeply, truly sorry. There's no excuse for how we acted. None at all. The stocky one stepped forward. We were completely out of line, disrespectful and ignorant. I'm ashamed of how we behaved. The lean one, who had been silent since the demonstration, finally found his voice. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life. Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry we didn't show you the respect you deserve. Maggie studied their faces for a moment, seeing genuine remorse rather than just embarrassment at being caught. Apology accepted, she said simply, but I want you to remember this feeling. The next time you see someone who looks different from what you expect, remember that you have no idea what they've been through or what they're capable of. Yes, ma'am, all three said almost in unison. An older woman who had been watching from lane 4 approached the group. Ma'am, my husband served in Vietnam. He always told me about people like you, the ones who did the hardest jobs and never talked about it. Thank you. Others began stepping forward. A middle-aged man who'd been quietly shooting at the far end introduced himself as a Marine veteran. A young woman mentioned that her brother was currently deployed overseas. One by one, people who had been strangers an hour ago were coming together around their shared respect for Maggie's service. The range owner, an older gentleman named Bill, who'd been in his office during the morning's events, came out to see what was causing the commotion. When he learned what had happened, he immediately approached Maggie. Ma'am, I would be honored if you'd accept a lifetime membership to our range, he said. No charge ever. And if you'd ever consider teaching some classes here, we'd be proud to have you. Maggie looked around at all the faces, some curious, some admiring, some still processing what they'd learned. I might take you up on that teaching offer, she said. There are a lot of people who could benefit from proper instruction. The tall one cleared his throat nervously. Ma'am, if you do teach classes, would it be possible for us to sign up? We clearly need to learn a lot more than we thought. Maggie smiled for the first time all morning, a real, warm smile that transformed her entire face. Of course, everyone can always improve their shooting, and more importantly, everyone can learn to treat others with respect. Frank was beaming as he watched the scene unfold. You know, this reminds me of something my old drill sergeant used to say. The quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. Or the most skilled, Walter added. Or the most experienced. Or the wisest. As the crowd began to disperse, people kept approaching Maggie to thank her for her service or to ask questions about her military experience. She answered each person graciously, though she kept the details modest and focused more on encouraging others to support current service members. The three men who had started the morning so full of themselves were now packing up their expensive equipment with a completely different attitude. They moved quietly, spoke respectfully to everyone around them, and waited patiently for their turn to speak with Maggie before leaving. When they finally approached her, the tall one spoke for the group. Ma'am, we learned something important today. Not just about shooting, but about character. We promise we'll remember this. See that you do, Maggie replied, and remember to pass it on. Respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything. As the three men left the range, their heads bowed in genuine humility, Frank turned to Maggie with a grin. Think they learned their lesson? I think they did, Maggie replied, carefully packing her rifle back into its worn leather case. Sometimes people just need a reminder that the world is full of surprises. Speaking of surprises, Walter said, I'd love to hear some of those Afghanistan stories sometime, if you're willing to share. Maggie closed her case and looked around the range one more time. For the first time in years, she felt like she'd found a place where she truly belonged. Come back next Tuesday morning, she said with a smile. I'll tell you a few stories and maybe we can work on improving your long-distance shooting. As she walked toward the exit, every person on the range nodded respectfully in her direction. The quiet grandmother who'd arrived that morning had left as a respected teacher, an honored veteran, and a reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover.